Hi everyone, my name is Sam. I am going to do a new series called A Chapter a Day Keeps the Fascists Away. So if you have been looking around at our country, and I'm from the United States, and you have been very concerned with what you are seeing, both from Democrats and Republicans, which you should be, in my opinion, then we are going to read some history and we are going to learn about how we got here so that we can figure out how to fix it. And if that seems overwhelming to you, then what we'll do is I'm going to point this camera out at the garden that we've been working on so you can watch the butterflies and the hummingbirds. You'll notice on this hummingbird feeder that we have a couple that like to fight with each other, and it's pretty hilarious. So you can watch the birds and hear the wind chimes, and I will read to you, and we will learn history, and we will get this figured out. So a lot of my specifically leftist creators have really recommended this book, so I'm pretty excited to read this with you guys, and we'll just do a chapter a day. Chapter a day keeps the fascists away, and I will start this series, and I may get a couple of chapters done up front and just put those in a series so you guys can take it in at your own pace. So yeah, all right, so I'll read the back of this book first. With an introduction by Anthony Arnaud, this edition of the classic national bestseller chronicles American history from the bottom up, throwing out the official narrative taught in schools with its emphasis on great men in high places, to focus on the street, the home, the workplace. Known for its lively, clear prose as well as its scholarly research, A People's History of the United States is the only volume to tell America's history from the point of view and in the words of America's women, factory workers, African Americans, Native Americans, the working poor, and immigrant laborers. As historian Howard Zinn shows, many of our country's greatest battles, fights for fair wages, 8-hour workdays, child labor laws, health and safety standards, universal suffrage, women's rights, racial equality, were carried out at the grassroots level against bloody resistance. Covering Christopher Columbus's arrival through President Clinton's first term, A People's History of the United States, which was nominated for the American Book Award in 1981, features insightful analysis of the most important events in our history. So we're gonna get started, and I am going to start with the introduction. All right, so introduction to the 35th anniversary edition of A People's History of the United States. Howard Zinn fundamentally changed the way millions of people think about history with A People's History of the United States. He would be the first to say, however, that he didn't do so alone. The book grew out of his awareness of the importance of social movements throughout U.S. history, some of which he played an active role in during the 1960s and 1970s and beyond, namely the civil rights movement, mass mobilizations to end the Vietnam War, as well as other anti-war movements, and the many movements for higher wages and workers' rights and the rights of women, Latinos, Native Americans, gays and lesbians, and others. He was also quick to acknowledge the many people who informed his view of history. Woody Guthrie, whose songs about working people in the 1930s and 40s opened up chapters of U.S. history to him that his formal education had kept hidden. Philip S. Foner, Herbert Aptheker, Richard Hofstadter, Elizabeth Martinez, and other writers, editors, librarians, and historians who unearthed what he calls the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than its solid centuries of warfare. But most of all, he acknowledged the people whose stories he weaves throughout this book: Eugene Debs, Fannie Lou Hamer, Frederick Douglass, Plow Jogger. Howard understood that he was writing to bring their voices and stories, their struggles and vision to light, and inspire people to make change themselves. That is why he was so keen to publish a companion book to this volume, Voices of a People's History of the United States, which compiles the speeches, letters, manifestos, and other documents of people's history that he drew on to write a people's history, and to also remind people that this history continues in new forms today. And it is why he wanted to make the documentary filmed People Speak, with artists such as Bob Dylan, Kerry Washington, Viggo Mortensen, and Danny Glover, to bring these voices vividly to life. He understood that his own words in this book, as meaningful as they are, were less vital to the success of a people's history than the words and actions of others he wove together into a narrative of U.S. history told from below. Howard was uniquely skilled as a writer, as this book reveals. Millions of people have read this book, a remarkable achievement for any work of popular history, and passed along their dog-eared copies to friends, family, fellow soldiers, and co-workers because it opened up new horizons for them. Of those readers, many went on to become teachers as a result. Many more felt the book had changed their lives and sent them down new paths. I'm one of them. Reading this book, and later having the great luck to meet and work with Howard, radically changed me. It made me care about history as no other teacher or experience had done, and it led me to see history as something that we are all part of making together, and to realize that how we understand our past informs us not only of how we see the present with all its complexity, but also how we might imagine a different future. When A People's History of the United States came out in 1980, its first print run was a few thousand hardcover copies, considered modest for HarperCollins. But it soon found an audience excited to read a book that provided such a comprehensive and artful bottom-up view of U.S. history, in contrast to the still dominant tropes of great white men and the occasional exceptional others who made history as an especially disempowering view. The civil rights leader Diane Nash, whom Howard knew through his work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, recently commented on how hard it has been for our culture to embrace histories that feature the efforts of ordinary people whose names we may not even know or rarely learn from our textbooks. Discussing the critics of Ava DuVernay's 2014 film Selma, who said it unfairly diminished the role of President Lyndon Baines Johnson in bringing about civil rights legislation, an argument with which Howard was extremely familiar, she responded, "Lyndon Johnson was president. It was his job to enforce the law. He should not have waited until Jimmy Lee Jackson's, James Reeves, and Viola Liuzzo's lives were taken. He should not have waited until people were beaten and bloodied on Pettus Bridge before he enforced Negroes' right to vote in the South. I appreciate LBJ's enacting and signing the Voting Rights Act, but I wish he had been a self-starter when it came to our right to vote, so it would not have been necessary to go to the lengths that we did, organizing a mass movement and risking our safety in order to get the vote. It was the courage, work, thoughtfulness, sacrifice, discipline, and determination of citizens of the United States that obtained our right to vote. Historically, inventions, musical innovations, and many more accomplishments and contributions developed by descendants of enslaved Africans in America have been misappropriated. We learn about presidents and battles and dates. The impression too often perpetuated in history books and in popular culture is that you have to be a president, someone special or white, to have an important idea or to achieve major accomplishments. This is an idea that disempowers citizens and should not be propagated further. Like Nash, Howard's experiences in the civil rights movement gave him a different understanding of how history is made. It's an understanding that informs every page of this book. When A People's History of the United States first came out, Ronald Reagan was on the path to becoming president. Culturally, the country was moving noticeably rightward. Movements that sought to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement, women's liberations movement, and other progressive changes of the 60s and 70s were gaining ground. Unions came under a sustained attack from which they have never recovered. In such an environment, this book could have been lost, published into obscurity. Why it wasn't is worth considering. First of all, as with any publishing effort, there was some luck involved. The New York Times Book Review could have decided the book didn't merit a review, as it so often does with books written from the standpoint of the left. Having decided to review it, the editors at the Times could have easily sent the book to be trashed by a figure of the newly aggressive right, as it so often does. Instead, they asked the highly regarded historian Eric Foner to review A People's History of the United States. And while not without criticisms of the book, Foner gave it an extremely positive notice. His words from March 2nd, 1980, New York Times Book Review are worth considering. The 1970s witnessed an unprecedented redefinition of historical studies, a byproduct of the ferment of the 1960s, in which the distinctive experience of blacks, women, Indians, workers, and other neglected groups moved to the forefront of inquiry. Howard Zinn is the first historian to attempt to survey all of American history from the perspective of the new scholarship. A distinguished scholar and the author of 9 previous books, Professor Zinn is also a veteran of the civil rights and anti-war movements and is currently an embattled defender of academic freedom at Boston University. He is refreshingly candid in announcing his purpose. Too much history, he contends, is written from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. His people's history, by way of contrast, sides with the losers, the downtrodden, the underdog. It is a book disrespectful of governments and respectful of people's movements of resistance. Professor Zinn writes with an enthusiasm rarely encountered in the leaden prose of academic history, and his text is studded with telling quotations from labor leaders, war resistors, and fugitive slaves. There are vivid descriptions of events that are usually ignored. However, Foner felt the book's salutary emphasis on the enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist is tempered by an underlying frustration at the meager results produced by this history of resistance. He continues, "The stirring protests, strikes, and rebellions never appear to accomplish anything. Uprisings are either crushed, deflected, or co-opted. Apparent victories, such as the emancipation of the slaves, simply serve the interests of businessmen. Incremental gains, such as those of the 1930s, merely stabilize the system. Why such movements often fail to achieve their goals is never adequately explained." Foner's view that the book reflects a deeply pessimistic vision of the American experience was, in the end, not shared by many other readers, who saw in the book a more affirmative, in fact inspirational story. Indeed, Howard is someone who consistently looked for the unrealized possibilities of history, one of the reasons this book has been considered so dangerous by so many figures of the establishment, whether in the academy or the halls of power. Howard was interested in her historical potential, the what might have been, the unrealized visions, the expanded horizons of protest, as much as he was in detailing forms of oppression. And a careful reading of this book will reveal, I believe, a deep appreciation of the human capacity to resist oppression, to collectively make history, to achieve ends those undertaking their protest perhaps never imagined possible, and often did not live to see realized in their lifetime, even while recognizing that such gains can prove fragile and can never be taken for granted. For Howard, also, there was a joy in the effort itself. He had an appreciation of the bonds of solidarity, mutual affection, and creative expression that participation in social movements produced. The idea that people make history and can alter its course, that institutions have human origins and can be changed by humans, is truly subversive, and is a central reason that this book has drawn the ire of so many censors and would-be censors. As Howard wrote at the end of his play Marx in Soho, "Remember, to be radical is simply to grasp the root of the problem, and the root is us." Among the first champions of a people's history of the United States were the thousands of students who had been part of Howard's classes at Spelman College and Boston University, and many others who heard him speak on their college campuses and at anti-war rallies, or ordered it immediately for themselves and in some cases for courses they were teaching. The movements of the 1960s and early 1970s had also nurtured a new generation of receptive readers, many of whom were moving into roles as educators in high schools and on college campuses. Howard's classes were so popular that Boston University sought to limit participation in them. Howard famously battled with the neoconservative president of the university, John Silber, coming close to losing his job on a few occasions, but in the end he came out on top. Comically, one university administrator responded to his appeal for more teaching assistants for his huge introductory class by saying Howard could have more TAs if he would agree to decrease the class size. Instead, Howard enlisted student volunteers who would take his classes 1 year for credit and then return the next year to lead sections. In a matter of weeks after the release of A People's History, HarperCollins found, unexpectedly, that it had sold out of its first hardcover edition. Then an interesting turn of history occurred. Howard's editor, Hugh Van Dusen, went to the hardcover division sales manager to push for a quick reprint and was rebuffed. The previous projections for the book were inauspicious. Perhaps there would be returns. A paperback would eventually come out in a future catalog. But Van Dusen fought for an accelerated paperback release, so much earlier than planned, the book was available in an affordable, popular edition. The book continued to catch on and became, as no one predicted, a cultural touchstone and publishing phenomenon. A book that each year sold more copies than the year before, the opposite of the traditional trajectory. As of 2015, A People's History of the United States has sold more than 2.6 million copies in North America and has been translated into more than 20 languages. Rarely does a month pass that I don't see someone engrossed in the book on the New York City subway system. One of the readers of those early copies of A People's History was young Matt Damon, whose mother, Nancy Carlson Page, was a friend and movement ally of Howard's in Boston. Matt would famously go on to write, with Ben Affleck, a scene in the Oscar-winning film Good Will Hunting in which the self-educated working-class math genius he plays calls A People's History a book that will knock you on your ass. That moment opened up new audiences for Howard and his work and his ideas, and A People's History entered into popular culture. Another reader was the cartoonist Matt Groening, who drew a copy of the book into an episode of his series The Simpsons. Later, HBO's acclaimed series The Sopranos constructed a storyline around Howard's critical view of Christopher Columbus. The episode opens with a close-up of Anthony Soprano Jr. reading a hardcover edition of the book. But it is really due to the many teachers heroically trying to encourage critical thinking among their students that this book continues to find new readers. This is not without its risks in this era of high-stakes testing and scapegoating teachers, while seeking to dismantle their unions and impose patriotic views of history. In 2014, in Colorado, students and teachers, some holding signs quoting Howard, walked out in protest when a local school board sought to ensure its advanced placement AP history courses promote citizenship, patriotism, essentials and benefits of the free market system, respect for authority, and respect for individual rights, and that they did not encourage or condone civil disorder, social strife, or disregard of the law. An inquesting challenge if you want to teach, for example, the American Revolution or the history of abolitionism. In Oklahoma, in February 2015, members of the Common Education Committee voted to ban all AP U.S. history courses because they focus on what is bad about America. In the state where I grew up, Indiana, when Governor Mitch Daniels, now the president of Purdue University, sent emails just days after Howard's death in January 2010 openly celebrating his passing and seeking to ensure that no Indiana teachers were using A People's History. "This terrible anti-American academic finally passed away," Daniels wrote. The obits and commentaries mentioned in his book, A People's History of the United States, is the test book of choice in high schools and colleges around the country. It is a truly execrable, anti-factual piece of disinformation that misstates American history on every page. Can someone assure me that it is not in use anywhere in Indiana? If it is, how do we get rid of it before any more young people are force-fed a totally false version of our history? It is clear why Daniels and his allies felt threatened by Howard's approach to history and his politics, and why someone who is seeking to dismantle present-day unions would not have wanted people studying the vital role they have played in protecting the rights of working people, or other examples of popular struggles challenging authority. Despite these attacks, and even at the risk of losing one's job, people have continued to assign Howard's book alongside the assigned textbook, share their personal copies, photocopy sections for students, and read aloud passages of A People's History. In addition to drawing on the book, growing numbers of teachers across the United States use curricula and resources from organizations such as Voices of A People's History of the United States, the Zinn Education Project, Rethinking Schools, and Teaching for Change to bring a people's history to life in the classroom. None of this is to say that Howard does not have his more serious critics, including those on the left. Howard had no issue with that. In encouraging critical thinking, he hoped people would apply the same independent mindset to his own views. That is why he opens A People's History of the United States by stating his point of view very directly. In that inevitable taking of sides, which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young woman in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers on Luzon, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, the Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, the post-war American Empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. Howard believed in laying his cards on the table. He did not hide behind the historian's easily available stance of distant, expert objectivity. He had a point of view and was happy to be challenged and engage in dialogue about it. There are some readers who wished he had included footnotes in this volume. Howard felt that missed the point of the book, which was to write an accessible and popular history. He wanted to welcome his readers, not intimidate them or scare them off, especially in a book that, at more than 600 pages, is already daunting to embark on for the first time. Other historians have found fault with Howard's departure from the narrow confines of academia. Howard was more comfortable on a picket line than at a session of the Organization of American Historians. He'd be the first to admit. More to the point, some readers have longed for more women's voices. Some have taken issue with his emphasis on spontaneity in history. My own feeling is that Howard's prediction in chapter 24 about the coming revolt of the guards, the intellectuals, the homeowners, the taxpayers, the skilled workers, the professionals, the servants of government, who make up the middle classes, was overly optimistic, as he himself later acknowledged. Yet at the same time, he was remarkably prescient in writing about what he calls the 99% versus the 1%, years before the Occupy movement popularized these terms. Interestingly, others claimed credit for this slogan or were given credit for it, ignoring Howard's much earlier use of the terms in this book. But such optimism was vital to Howard's politics and personality. It is what led him to undertake so ambitious a project as a people's history of the United States in the first place, an outcome that he frequently said would never have been possible without the encouragement of his wife, Rosalind Zinn. It is what brought him and his family to teach at Spelman College and become unexpectedly participants in the civil rights movement. It is what led him to write 3 plays, Emma, Daughter of Venus, and Marx in Soho, in addition to his many other important works of history. Fundamentally, Howard had a confidence in people's ability to work together and change their circumstances. In a recent essay, the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin speaks of the honest, uncompromising search for a realistic hope and a chance to transcend the paralyzing hierarchies of gender, race, class, nation, a chance to find a radical cure for the radical evil of our social system. Howard Zinn believed in taking that chance and holding out that hope, but he did so because he was grounded in all the examples from our past. The abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, the struggle for the right to organize unions and to work an 8-hour day. When people proved that causes that at one point seemed unrealistic and hopeless proved otherwise, and in doing so provided that the Welsh socialist and cultural theorist Raymond Williams called resources of hope. In a way, the success of A People's History of the United States is an embodiment of Howard's wager on optimism. A People's History provided sustenance to a progressive countercurrent that developed from the early 1980s and grew as teachers, organizers, and the next generation of students developed new political initiatives and movements. Howard dedicated our book, Voices of a People's History of the United States, to the rebel voices of the coming generation. At every step on that journey, Howard was there to fight alongside them. Throughout, in his many lectures, interviews, and speeches to anti-war protests, from the smallest gatherings to rallies of tens of thousands, he reminded us of the history of social change in his country and kept coming back to his core ideas, that change comes from below, that progress comes only from people resisting and organizing, workers going on strike, consumers boycotting, soldiers refusing to fight, saying no to injustice and war, that we cannot rely on elected officials or leaders, but instead have to rely on our individual and collective actions. That change never happens in a straight line, but always has ups and downs, twists and turns, and that there are no guarantees in history. But Howard added a distinctive element to these arguments by embodying the understanding that the shared experience of working alongside others for political change is the most rewarding, fulfilling, and meaningful life one can live. The sense of solidarity he had with people in struggle, the sense of joy he had in life was infectious. He communicated to everyone around him that they mattered, that they were an active part of making history. In an article on the labor organizer and socialist Eugene Debs that Howard wrote in 1990s, he said, "We are always in need of radicals who are also lovable," adding that we need to learn from Debs a determination to hold up before a troubled public those ideas that are both bold and inviting. The more bold, the more inviting. When the actor David Strathairn, read those lines at a celebration of Howard's life and work in California soon after his passing, it was clear to all of us in the audience that those words described Howard as much as they did Debs. Howard's ideas were bold, inviting, inspiring. There are, from time to time, people who can crystallize the aims or goals of a movement in an especially compelling way, who can rally greater numbers of people to take a particular action and, in the case of Howard, make a lifelong commitment to activism. But such people cannot substitute for a movement. Debs, who understood this problem well, once put it this way: I am no Moses to lead you out of the wilderness, because if I could lead you out, someone else could lead you in again. That was the spirit of Howard. Think for yourself, act for yourself, challenge and question authority, but do it with others. As he wrote in Marx and Soho, if you are going to break the law, do it with 2,000 people. And Mozart. In looking at Howard's lifetime of work and his remarkable example, he has something else to teach us that is very important. As urgent as the present moment is, we need to build and strategize for the long term and have the patience to weather the setbacks and challenges that are coming. The kind of change we want, systemic change, will not happen overnight. Howard achieved much in his lifetime, but as the continued impact of this book attests, his legacy continues. It continues in new scholarship, such as An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and A People's History of Sports by Dave Zinn, the album Let England Shake by P.J. Harvey, People's Libraries and Zinn lectures at Occupy encampments, and in movements for labor rights, among so many other examples. It continues in classrooms where people are discussing and debating Howard's approach to history. It continues on the demonstrations where people hold placards with Howard's powerful words on war and social change. And it continues now with you. Anthony Arnove, who did this introduction, wrote, directed, and produced The People Speak with Howard Zinn. He is the editor of several books, including Voices of a People's History of the United States, which Arnove co-edited with Zinn and was released in an updated 10th century edition in 2014. Howard Zinn Speaks, The Essential Chomsky, a book of interviews with Zinn, Terrorism and War, and Iraq Under Siege, and is the author of Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal. He was a producer of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Dirty Wars and is on the editorial board of Haymarket Books and International Socialist Review. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me for the introduction. I am going to immediately do Chapter 1 if you're wanting to keep going. And thanks for joining me. Let's get through this hellhole together, shall we? Let's learn some history a little bit at a time. We'll learn how to step away from the systems that are currently making all of us miserable and destroying the earth, and we'll figure out how to move forward and go from there. Thanks, everyone.